Welcome to episode 3 of our show. LJ, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Will. How's your evening going?
It's going splendid. I got a nice bubble tea today, so
Jealous.
you can never go wrong with bubble tea on a Wednesday. Hump day, but actually no, long weekend this upcoming weekend.
It's
So
a
really
long
excited.
weekend. Yeah, I'm really
Yeah.
looking forward to that and looking forward to spending some time in the backyard. One of the warmest weekends yet for this year. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and happy Easter to all those celebrating. And I know there's been a lot of holidays recently to the different cultural communities. So we're really excited for all of you, and hopefully you have some time with your families. I'm speaking today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Kaikat nations here in Burnaby, British Columbia.
Today I'm speaking from the territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations.
And we acknowledge again the role of colonialism, of the harm done to Indigenous communities, and the importance of not only recognizing this as a legal contract at the beginning of our show, but also in our own efforts in our own podcast. And we'll have we have a lot of ideas coming up in this area, and we look forward to sharing them with all of you. For this episode today, we wanted to delve into immigration storytelling, which I think for both of us, LJ, is one of our favorite parts of immigration, the human story behind the process that we often have to do the paperwork for.
And tonight I'm going to code switch a bit. And if you'll indulge me for a few seconds or maybe a minute, magandang umaga, tanghali, hapon at gabi sa ating mga tagatangkilik. Salamat sa pagsubaybay sa aming podcast, IMMLight of All Circumstances. Ngayong gabi ating makakapanayam ang isang mamamahayag na aking kababayan actually, si Johna Baylon. Isa siyang mamamahayag at ang gaya nga ni Johna, mga mamahayag ay tunay na nagbibigay buhay sa mga kwentong kadalasang naiiwanan sa paglathala ng mga naratibong dominante. So right now, I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce our guest, Ms. Johna Baylon.
Absolutely. So Johna Baylon is a freelance journalist for New Canadian Media. She immigrated to Canada just before the start of the pandemic, and her immigration route was through spousal sponsorship. She's currently, as we mentioned, a freelance journalist working for New Canadian Media, but some of her work has also appeared in the Toronto Star and in many other publications. She's an incredible writer. She was a copywriter in the Philippines and in Hong Kong. And then we actually met Johna LJ through both being interviewees in two separate stories that she did, eh?
That's right. And tonight we flip the mic. It's our turn to interview the journalist.
Absolutely. So we were both in two stories, one on caregivers and one on the Canadian experience as code for racial profiling. We find that her work is super humanizing. It touches the hearts of those who read it. We're super excited to have her on our show today. Full disclosure, I was a former contributor for the New Canadian Media and a brief time was the chair of the board. This is unrelated to any of that, but I wanted to declare any possible conflicts, of course, as we always do in these type of settings.
Hello, Johna. How are you doing today? Welcome.
I'm good. Thank you, LJ, Will, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you on board. So why don't we dive into it? We did a little bit of introduction, and we introduced you as one of the up-and-coming journalists in immigration news. But we wanted to learn more about your background. So could you give us maybe 3 things or maybe milestones that captures your immigration story?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very generous. Thank you for your kind words. I really am new to writing about immigration. So 3 things. I was born in the Philippines and then moved to Hong Kong before I even turned 1. I grew up there and then moved back to the Philippines just as I was wrapping up high school. So I lived in the Philippines for a while and then moved back to Hong Kong and spent a lot of, my earlier professional life there. And then 2 years ago, moved to Vancouver. So I think to answer your question, one part of my immigration background is really that I've moved a lot because of other people. My dad was an engineer, and he was among, I guess, a wave of Filipino engineers that migrated to Hong Kong in the early 90s. And then it was because of my parents' immigration that I became a permanent resident. And it's because of that I was able to move back to Hong Kong from Manila with relative ease after I graduated, after I worked for a bit in the Philippines. And then my coming here is because of my husband. He is Filipino Canadian, he's a Canadian citizen. And that's how I was able to migrate through spousal sponsorship, I think it's called. I hope that answers your question. I'd say that probably is one highlight. A second, I guess the second piece of my story, or just really my own experiences, is that as an immigrant, you shift identities a lot, or you negotiate your own identity a lot. I, growing up in Hong Kong, attending a government school, it was a local school. We had classmates from India, from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from Nepal. Like, you assume that is the norm in the rest of the world. And it wasn't really until I moved back to the Philippines that I realized what I considered normal was only one type of normal. And it wasn't until then that I also learned that what I considered, my being Filipino is only really a fraction of what my new friends, my new classmates considered being Filipino. Yeah, and then coming back to Hong Kong as an adult, it's a different kind of shift now too. So the second piece I would say is a lot of the identity negotiating or identity shifting. Um, you know, I moved to Hong Kong before I turned one, and I grew up there. And I went to a school, a government school. It was a local school in Hong Kong where I had classmates from India, from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from Nepal. And so everyone I knew had home elsewhere, and I assumed that was normal. It wasn't until my family migrated back to the Philippines that I realized my normal was only really one type of normal. Um, and what I had considered myself being Filipino is really only a fraction of what, my friends in the Philippines considered being Filipino, having grown up there. So it was very different. And I think when I was younger, it was all as when you're younger, you're always looking for ways to fit in. And I think when I first moved to the Philippines, it was okay, how do I fit into local Philippine culture? And finally, I spent 7 years, only 7 years in Manila or in the Philippines. When I finally moved back to Hong Kong, this time like as I would say a young adult, I realized as well that um, I could say I grew up in Hong Kong. I'm Hong Konger generally, but I was also freshly coming from the Philippines, um and so it was again a lot of shifting. Like, well, how much of my Hong Kongness am I going to assert now or insist on? Because I really, I grew up here, and this is such a big part of my identity. And when do I play out the Filipino parts of me? Is it when I'm with my Filipino community, when I'm at home with my family? So sorry, that's a lot of words just to say. I think a second big piece of my immigration um, experiences really a lot of identity shifting and negotiating. Um, and third, I would say now, having come to Canada, it's a lot of reckoning, a lot of wrestling. Not to go too deep into it, but um, I moved to Vancouver 2 years ago, in 2019, and doing all the paperwork as an adult, encountering the immigration system firsthand, was difficult. And I think I've been really fortunate by many measures, but it was still really frustrating, for example, to be required certain documents just because my passport didn't qualify for some, waiver of certain requirements. Realizing that even if I, had an education, even if I had a job, things I felt should be sufficient. For some reason, again, because I had a Philippine passport, it wasn't counted or wasn't enough, so to speak. So um, going through all of that, I realized that um, immigration is a lot, I think it's different having distance from it and having your parents go through it and seeing other people do it. That's very different from you yourself going through it and realize and having to sort of wrestle with the variables that affect your own personal experience. So,
When did you first hear about Canada? And I tell this story with a story of my own that when my spouse first heard of Canada was when essentially she met me. The whole family had no clue where Canada was. They knew about the United States, but they knew very little about Canada, let alone Vancouver, where we're both, we call our hometown now. So how about for yourself? Like, when did you first hear about Canada? Was it always on your sort of radar prior to even a relationship, or did it somehow come up in the context of the relationship? Or
mm,
yeah.
right. It's funny you bring that up because I mean, I I think at the back of my head, I knew Canada was a country a lot of people immigrated to. It wasn't on my radar in terms of, if you had asked me 10 years ago where I wanted to move to, I would have picked another country possibly, just really out of preference at the time. And also, after I moved back to Hong Kong, I had a lot of friends that were Canadian Chinese. And it was very interesting because, again, I was sort of starting out in my career. I was meeting a lot of people who had moved to Hong Kong from Canada to build their own professional lives. So, I mean, my impression, somebody actually told me this, so it's not an original impression. Someone told me Canada is a great place to retire. So that was sort of the impression I had of the country prior to coming here.
That's interesting. There's actually a Chinese saying, 好山好水好无聊, just good mountains, good water, but very boring. So it's suitable for retirement. I don't know if that still reigns true today. I guess with COVID, everyone's a little bit bored. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit, maybe, Jonah, also about the hybridity? I mean, that part really fascinates me, where you talk about how when you went back to the Philippines, you felt like you're taking part of that. You have to relearn sort of parts of it, or take parts of Hong Kong with you there. But also going to Hong Kong as someone from the Philippines, a Philippines national, like, what did you learn about maybe your own culture, or in what ways did you hybridize those two really strong and beautiful cultures?
Mhm. So, I think to the first part of your question, when I moved to the Philippines and I did my last year of high school there, I attended a school in Cavite. It's a province south of Metro Manila, and we were told that that the medium of teaching would be English. So, as a 14-year-old, a lot more confident, I suppose, than I probably should have been, and eager to make friends. I was very outgoing and I was speaking in English. And it wasn't until recess that I realized English was used in the classroom. Outside of the classroom, everyone spoke Tagalog, which is fair. But I didn't know that. And I think just to be transparent as well, um, in I'm going to speak from my experience. I don't know if this is true for all Filipinos. Um, but if you spoke English in the Philippines, there are connotations to that. There are assumptions about where you're from or what your family background is like. Um, so my family is very middle class. I just happened to grow up in Hong Kong where we were taught in English. We all spoke English. And so I think trying to fit in and learning more about my roots, I guess you could say. Um, I think I learned a lot about, a lot of unspoken expectations, a lot of how you should behave or how you should speak to people, how to, not to say that I was trying to be fake. I think I was just really learning how to integrate and assimilate. Yeah, and I think I think English as a language, there are things you can say that are not offensive, when you're joking around with friends. I think if I said the same things in the Philippines, it might be blunt. It might not really be nice or cool to say. It might actually sometimes even be offensive. So those were the things I was learning. In terms of, I think, hybridity, maybe I was learning to dilute a bit of my Hong Kongness, or what I knew to be myself as a Hong Konger, at that age. And then coming back to Hong Kong from the Philippines was also very interesting and very difficult. I I was very I was very eager to go back to the Hong Kong I knew as a kid. But again, years pass and you grow up and people around you grow up and you're starting to enter the workforce. I don't think at that time I was aware too much about what being Filipino, or what that might mean socially. It's not that it means anything negative or positive socially. I just really wasn't aware of any of these things. So I think, to the best of my ability, when I moved back to Hong Kong, I was just trying to be myself, just trying to reintegrate back into Hong Kong as a city. I can go down this rabbit hole too, so um, feel free to stop
I
me.
love how it actually circles back to your point about shifting and negotiated identities and trying to fit back into the Filipino cultural matrix, then having to move back to Hong Kong, which is a really excellent segue to the question that I wanted to ask you about, appreciating all of this, I guess, like stepping back from it, appreciating it from the lenses of race, class, and gender, and moving thousands and thousands of kilometers between two homes, so to speak. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about your understanding of these nuances when you went back to Hong Kong?
All right, I can start with class. It's very difficult and uncomfortable to talk about it, but I want to be honest. I feel like, um, there's so there when we say Filipino, or when you tell somebody you're Filipino or you're from the Philippines, I now know there are assumptions to that. Um, and assumptions I am learning are really, really untrue. And you can meet a Filipino in Hong Kong. You can meet two Filipinos in Hong Kong, and they would have wildly different backgrounds. And the same thing will happen when you move to the Philippines, and here, as I'm learning, in Canada too. And I say class because, in like I said earlier, in the Philippines, when you speak in English, there are also assumptions that I wish did not exist, because it reflects, or it reflects the reality that there is some form of hierarchy. There is power, for example, to attending an international school. There is power, for example, to sounding more Western, to speaking English with an accent, in the Philippines. And I didn't attend an international school. I um, I I wouldn't say I spoke with an accent, but I won't deny it if people asked me about it. I won't deny that people did ask me about it. The class intersectionality, I feel like, is key, because it has so many implications. I remember attending university in Manila. If you've been to the Philippines and you've seen how the transportation system works or does not work, you would understand that, you'd assume that a lot of people, um, that attend university probably live close to the university, or if they had to travel back and forth, you knew it was a misery to commute in the Philippines. You would also probably just guess that people drove or were driven to their campus. I commuted, from Cavite to Manila to Taft daily for my classes. LGIC, your
Whoa,
expression. I can
yeah,
talk. I feel like this is a story for another day. I can talk to you about how, like, what an experience that was, just commuting, the hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on which way you were going,
that's
um,
right.
daily. And that was one way. Anyway, sorry, all of that to just sort of illustrate, the very daily, everyday, banal reality of commuting in the Philippines. And I remember somebody making a comment to me and saying, you don't sound like you commute. And I don't know what they meant by that. I will not assume, what they meant by that. But when I heard that, it also made me ask, like, well, what do you mean it does not sound like I commute? Because I do. Um, so, so I think that's a class. I feel like that's I think class, like I said, is really key. Another example I would say is um, in Hong Kong. I have a lot of friends that are teachers, and I'm aware that um, there is the unspoken sort of rule that a lot of schools will hire you if you sound more Western in your English. If you're an English teacher, for example, um, and this is something so I think a clear example for me would be there was a time in my earlier in my career when I applied as sort of an English teacher. I did that for like a month and it didn't really last long. I didn't stick to it. But long story short, I was at an interview and the interviewee was really nice. She was very candid with me and she was just talking. And somewhere in her spiel, just looking at my resume, she says, "Oh, the kindergartens, they won't hire you because you're not white. The parents won't like that," so on and so forth. So it was another very telling comment. And again, my experiences are very different. I don't think this is true. I wouldn't say this is true for every Filipino. Um, but I feel like these are realities that we can't deny. Like, I think in many ways, I've been fortunate because of my proximity somewhat to whiteness. But but that is something I'm only like learning recently. Um, yeah, and it's really uncomfortable, but I feel like it's a reality. So
And to your
sorry, I hope,
point, in
yeah.
fact, you're absolutely right. These are really powerful points you're teasing out of your life, and thank you for sharing all of that. One thing that really strikes me is the fact that the interstitiality of your identity, if I may, the having to fit in and having to constantly flip, code switch, and having to evaluate like different cultural contexts puts you in a very interesting position to actually write about immigration stories. What do you think, Will?
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that I'm curious about, Jonah, is, you went from copywriting and probably some writing that was in a very different context to now, calling individuals who are in the middle of very sometimes traumatic experiences, a lot of heartache and pain, and they're sharing your stories and they're opening up to you. And I was wondering, with that transition, how has that been, and what are some of the early lessons you've learned from this process that you could share with other aspiring writers or those who want to better tell stories?
Hmm. Um, that's a great question. I've only been writing about immigration for the last 4 months, so I am by no means an expert, and I am learning a lot from, other folks in the industry. Um, but what I have learned, and just going back to English, so I did work as a copywriter in Hong Kong for a bit. So a lot of my work as a copywriter involved translating from just very rough Chinese to English translation and then turning tailoring them for the more native English market. um, and back then I didn't really value that as as a skill so much. But looking back, I one thing I've learned is that um, people use language very differently. People communicate very differently. And I think it's really, really important to just be conscious that when someone uh, is trying to express themselves in a language in their own second language, it might also be challenging for them. And I think for me as somebody that's interviewing them, I I think there really is no harm in sort of just rechecking what they've said to be sure you understood them correctly. But also to, keep in mind that if they say something, for example, that um, like if a Westerner would hear it, it sounds very strange or very different. Like just kind of look for the meaning that they're trying to say in there, because it's somewhere there. They're probably just not communicating it as fluidly as someone speaking in English in a first language. So I think that's one thing I've learned. And a second thing that I have learned is that um, people, immigrants coming here, it's really not easy. And I think there there can be an assumption after reading a lot of immigration stories. There can be assumption that, well, maybe some people are just unprepared, or maybe some people didn't read through all the requirements properly, and that's why when they arrive here, they're having trouble. Um, and I've learned that that's really not true. And what what I feel like is what I'm learning is that when someone doesn't have power, it doesn't mean they do not have agency. And I think immigrants have agency, and I feel like it's really important when we're writing their stories to center the story on them. A lot of the times, uh, for example, someone I'm speaking to, I did, I had to leave my job, I had to leave my family, I had to save to come here, only for all of these, only to be unable to move forward. I think it's on the one hand, it's very easy to be like, oh, poor you, what happened? Why can't you do this? I think on the other side of that coin is, well, you've done everything. What are you facing now? And often what immigrants are facing is really a broken system, or if I may say it, a system that might be rigged maybe against their favor. So I
Facts.
think it's really important to be cognizant of the way we tell people's stories. It's really less likely that these things are happening not because immigrants don't have power. It's because there are systems that really disempower the people that come here. That's very specific to certain stories, I think. And so maybe I feel like it's also fair to point out that you know, there really are so many facets to any human being's life. And I feel like immigration is one facet. It would be really nice as well to hear stories about, what people like to eat, for example, or what people like to do, things like lifestyle, other facets to the life of immigrants. I hope to be able to tell more of those stories in the future. But so these are, I think, things that I am learning, and I mean, I hope it's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think, is it as much you seeking out those stories, or are all those stories also like, do you find that people are also coming to you to share their experiences, or is it a bit of both, like just through your work so far? Do you feel like you're sort of jumping into their space and being asked to be their guest, or are some of them being like, Johna, I read what you wrote, I need to talk to you about, this, what I'm going through, because I don't think anyone else can write it better than you can, or explain it in a humanizing way?
Hmm. It's been a mix. The few stories I have worked on, it's been a mix. I would say 50-50. The first story I wrote was the result of me looking for people to speak to about something else entirely. And the person was generous enough to be like, hey, this, I'm coming to you not for what you were asking for, but there's something else I want to talk to you about that I think is an issue. So I've been really fortunate for that balance. But yeah, and in terms of coming to people for their stories, it's a lot to ask for someone, not just for their 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but them to sort of recount their lives. So um, it's hard, and I think I think people can say no. They don't have to. They don't owe any journalist their story. But if they happen to be willing and they happen to be open to having their story shared, then that'd be great as well. So yeah.
That's a really good point that segues into my question, actually. What would you change in order to actually, you know, change the tone, I suppose, of journalism and where it meets immigration stories?
That's a good question and a big question. I I think when on one level, these immigration stories are really important. I think a part of me is cognizant that the stories I'm telling aren't necessarily news, and that this is the first time it's happening. Um, a lot of the times I'm learning these, maybe the issues, maybe the problems have been going on for years and years and years. So I think it's really important to continue covering these stories. Um, and like I said earlier, I think it's also really important to start, to center stories around the people we're writing about, the communities we're writing about. Um, I think in every story there really is a tension in there, and I think when we're talking about people, inevitably there there is, an element of a power imbalance, and I think we have to be really conscious of how we're framing that power imbalance. I'm not saying frame a story to fit your agenda. That really isn't supposed to be what we're doing, but I think more and more it's important that we don't miss the humanity, just the reality that the next person coming to Canada is every bit the same as you and I, and the only difference is that, you know they're probably just waiting for another document. um, and and there's no reason. I think what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, it's important to honor the difficulties and the realities, but on the other hand, it's also really important to recognize the agency that does exist, and you know the willpower that is coming from immigrants when they come here. Again, oftentimes I think a lot of the times what people are coming up against is a systemic uh, brokenness, is a systemic power imbalance, and it's really important to ensure that that comes through. And it's not that a lot of immigrants are just struggling all the time. Often it's a broken system that is, you know, keeping them there.
Absolutely. One last question, because I know this conversation I feel like it could go for hours. We're learning
Yeah.
so much from you. You're an incredible speaker and storyteller. And I think both of LJ and I are just captured by your words
I'm just
here.
in awe.
Me too. So, Johna, last question, and this one might be a sensitive one, but I think it's worth asking. Obviously, there's been a lot of developments in Hong Kong recently, right? And Hong Kong being your home for so many years, and either your main home or one of your two homes, if you consider Philippines and Hong Kong both your homes. What are your thoughts about the coverage right now of what's going on in Hong Kong, and where do you think, maybe, being a journalist yourself, where can more light be shone on the situation?
That's a good and important question to ask. I think the coverage, I'm not reporting on it, so I can't really speak for those that are. I I do think there have been reporters that are doing good work around the issue, and a lot of these reporters I follow on Twitter. Um, and I personally am very curious to know more about the, I guess, I guess Hong Kongers who might be leaving because of that. But equally important, I think, are what it's been like for those that are rooted in the city, that will probably not leave because it's their home, and for many as well who don't have the option to leave. Um, I might just, I probably haven't come across coverage of that, but I think those areas are important. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't, I think that those who have been covering it are doing a good job. Um, yeah, and it's unfortunate what's happening. I am aware that I am of one opinion. I think there are people that would disagree too. So